The year was 1241, and Europe trembled beneath the thunder of hooves that seemed to shake the very foundations of Christendom. From the sprawling plains of Hungary to the fortified cities of Poland, a terror unlike anything the continent had ever witnessed was sweeping westward with the fury of an unstoppable storm. The armies that had conquered China, decimated the Islamic world, and brought the mighty Khwarezmian Empire to its knees, now turned their attention to the knights and kingdoms of medieval Europe. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a masterclass in warfare that would forever shatter European notions of martial supremacy. In just 3 catastrophic days, the flower of European chivalry would be systematically destroyed by an enemy they barely understood and consistently underestimated. The Mongol war machine, perfected through decades of conquest across Asia, was about to demonstrate why it remained the most feared force on 100,000 European knights. This is the story of how finest heavy cavalry that medieval warfare could produce met their doom at the hands of warriors who fought with tactics so alien, so revolutionary, that contemporary chroniclers struggled to comprehend what had transpired. The battles of Mohi and Legnica would become synonymous with military annihilation, marking the moment when the old world of European warfare collided with the brutal efficiency of Mongol strategy. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, we must first grasp what these European knights represented. These were not mere soldiers, but the apex of medieval military might, each warrior worth a dozen common footmen in both cost and capability. Encased in steel from head to toe, mounted on powerful destriers bred specifically for war, they formed the backbone of every European army. Their training began in childhood, their equipment cost fortunes, and their social status elevated them above common mortals. The knightly class had dominated European battlefields for centuries through the devastating effectiveness of the heavy cavalry charge. When hundreds of armored horsemen thundered across a field in tight formation, lowered lances creating a steel-tipped forest of death, few forces could withstand the impact. This tactic had proven itself time and again against Saracens in the Holy Land, against Vikings in the north, and in countless feudal conflicts across the continent. But the Mongols who approached Europe's borders in 1241 were unlike any enemy these knights had ever faced. Led by Batu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, and guided by the tactical genius of Subutai, perhaps history's greatest military strategist, this was an army that had perfected the art of war through constant campaigning across the known world. The Mongol military system represented a complete revolution in warfare, where European armies relied on individual prowess and the shock value of heavy cavalry. The Mongols fought coordinated organism, each unit functioning in perfect harmony with the whole. Their horses were smaller, but infinitely more agile than European destriers, capable of covering vast distances at speeds that seemed impossible to their enemies. Every Mongol warrior was first and foremost an archer, trained from childhood to loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Their composite bows, crafted from horn, sinew, and wood, could drive arrows through mail at ranges that European crossbows could not match. But perhaps most importantly, they fought with a tactical flexibility that allowed them to adapt to any battlefield situation with lightning speed. The European response to this approaching threat revealed the fundamental flaws in medieval military thinking. King Bela IV of Hungary, Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia, and countless other nobles viewed the Mongol invasion through the lens of traditional warfare. They saw mounted archers as light cavalry, suitable perhaps for harassment, but incapable of standing against the might of Christian knights in a proper battle. This catastrophic misunderstanding would cost them everything. Intelligence reports reaching European courts described the Mongols in terms that seemed almost fantastical. Chroniclers wrote of armies that moved like the wind itself, appearing where they were least expected, vanishing before counterattacks could be organized. They spoke of warriors who could ride for days without rest, who lived on mare's milk and dried meat, who seemed more demon than human in their endurance and ferocity. Yet European military doctrine remained unchanged. The response to every threat was the same: gather the knights, form the charge, and trust in the proven supremacy of heavy cavalry. This rigid thinking, which had served Europe well against conventional enemies, would prove utterly inadequate against an opponent who had spent generations perfecting the art of destroying exactly this type of warfare. The Mongol invasion of Europe began with their characteristic psychological warfare. Refugees fleeing eastward brought tales of cities reduced to ash, of populations slaughtered to the last soul, of resistance that seemed to melt away before the advancing horde. These stories were not mere propaganda, but calculated terror morale before, designed to weaken enemy the first arrow was loosed. As the Mongol Tumans swept into Hungary and Poland, they demonstrated the mobility that made them virtually unstoppable. Operating in multiple columns that could converge with perfect timing or disperse to avoid concentrated resistance, they moved faster than news of their approach. European commanders found themselves constantly reacting to Mongol initiatives, never able to seize the tactical advantage that their heavy cavalry required. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241. King Bela IV had assembled what he believed was an overwhelming force. Nearly 65,000 men, including the finest knights of Hungary, supported by infantry, crossbowmen, and even some early firearms. The royal army took position on the west bank of the Sajo River, confident that the Mongols would be forced to attack across the water against prepared defenses. This proved fat confidence, wholly misplaced. Subutai had no intention of launching a frontal assault against entrenched positions. Instead, he divided his forces, sending one column to cross the river upstream under cover of darkness, while another feinted at the main crossing. The Europeans, focused on the obvious threat to their front, failed to detect the enveloping movement until it was far too late. When dawn broke on April 11th, the Hungarian army found itself surrounded. The Mongols had achieved tactical surprise despite facing a numerically superior enemy on ground of that enemy's choosing. What followed was not a battle in the traditional European sense, but a systematic destruction of everything medieval warfare represented. The Mongol attack began with a devastating arrow storm that turned the morning sky dark with missiles. European mail armor, designed to stop sword cuts and spear thrusts, proved inadequate against the penetrating power of Mongol arrows, loosed from their powerful composite bows. Knights who had considered themselves invulnerable found their horses collapsing beneath them, struck down by arrows that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Attempts to organize the traditional cavalry charge failed completely. Every time European knights gathered for an assault, Mongol-like cavalry would appear as if from nowhere, shower them with arrows, and vanish before the heavy cavalry could close the distance. The very mobility that made the knights devastating against conventional enemies became a liability as their armor-encumbered horses proved incapable of catching the swift Mongol ponies. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. European knights, trained from childhood to believe in their martial superiority, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. The Mongols showed no interest in glorious single combat or honorable charges. They fought to win, using every advantage their superior mobility and archery provided. As the morning progressed, the Hungarian formation began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure of coordinated Mongol attacks. Units that had never known defeat found themselves isolated and destroyed piecemeal. The careful battle lines that European military theory demanded became death traps as Mongol arrows found their mark with mechanical precision. The slaughter at Mohi was just beginning, and hundreds of miles away, another European army was about to discover that the age of knightly dominance was coming to a bloody end. Meanwhile, at Legnica in Silesia, Duke Henry the Pious was making the same fatal assumptions that had doomed his Hungarian counterparts. The Polish Duke had assembled a formidable coalition of Christian warriors, drawing knights not only from Poland, but from across Europe. Templars, Hospitallers and Teutonic knights rode alongside Polish nobility, their banners creating a tapestry of medieval Christendom's finest military orders. The European commanders at Legnica possessed every advantage that medieval military doctrine proclaimed necessary for victory. They held superior numbers in heavy cavalry, their knights wore the finest armor that European metallurgy could produce, and their war horses represented generations of selective breeding for battlefield supremacy. Most importantly, they fought on familiar ground against an enemy they believed they understood. This confidence would prove to be their undoing in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The Mongol force approaching Legnica appeared deceptively small to European observers. Baidar and Kadan, grandsons of Genghis Khan, commanded what seemed like a modest reconnaissance force compared to the massive Christian army arrayed against them. European scouts reported enemy numbers that seemed almost insulting in their insignificance, leading Duke Henry to believe he faced nothing more than a raiding party that had strayed too far from its main force. The battle commenced on April 9, 1241, just 2 days before the catastrophe at Mohi, with the Europeans displaying all the tactical rigidity that had characterized their military thinking for generations. Duke Henry deployed his forces according to established doctrine: heavy cavalry in the center, infantry supporting the flanks, and crossbowmen providing ranged support. The formation looked magnificent, a steel-clad testament to European martial prowess that had dominated battlefields from England to the Holy Land. The Mongols approached this imposing display with tactics that seemed almost contemptuous in their simplicity. Rather than forming traditional battle lines, they dispersed into their characteristic loose formations, creating targets that appeared vulnerable to the devastating heavy cavalry charge that European commanders planned to unleash. This apparent disorder convinced Duke Henry that victory was not merely possible, but inevitable. The first European charge thundered across the battlefield with all the terrible majesty that had made heavy cavalry the master of medieval warfare. Hundreds of armored knights, their lances lowered in perfect unison, crashed toward the Mongol lines with the force of an avalanche. The ground trembled beneath iron-shod hooves as the flower of Polish chivalry committed itself to what they believed would be a decisive assault. The Mongols responded with a tactical maneuver that defied every principle of European military understanding. Rather than standing firm to receive the charge or attempting to flee from its overwhelming power, they executed a feigned retreat so convincing that European observers believed they had witnessed the enemy's complete collapse. The Mongol warriors wheeled their horses and galloped away from the advancing knights with apparent panic, abandoning their positions in what looked like utter rout. Duke Henry's knights pursued with savage enthusiasm, convinced that they had broken the enemy's will to fight before the battle had truly begun. The chase stretched across miles of Silesian countryside as the Europeans followed their fleeing opponents deeper and deeper into terrain of the Mongols' choosing. What the knights interpreted as cowardice was actually the execution of a trap so sophisticated that European military theory had no framework for comprehending it. The pursuit continued until the European cavalry found themselves stretched across vast distances, their formations broken by the demands of the chase, their horses exhausted from the sustained gallop. Individual knights, eager for glory and convinced of easy victory, had pressed far ahead of their supporting units. The disciplined battle lines that had begun the engagement had dissolved into scattered groups of warriors pursuing what they believed was a thoroughly beaten enemy. It was at this moment of maximum European vulnerability that the Mongols revealed the true nature of their tactical genius. The retreating warriors suddenly wheeled their horses with precision that seemed almost supernatural, transforming from fleeing cowards into a coordinated killing machine in the span of heartbeats. Fresh Mongol units, concealed throughout the countryside, emerged from hidden positions to complete an encirclement that trapped the scattered European knights in a web of death. In those 3 blood-soaked days of April 1241, the Mongols had accomplished what seemed impossible: the complete annihilation of European military supremacy. 100,000 knights, the finest warriors that Christendom could produce, lay scattered across the battlefields of Mohi and Legnica, their steel armor no match for Mongol arrows, their proud war horses feeding the carrion birds. The age of heavy cavalry had ended not with honor, but with systematic slaughter, executed by warriors who understood that victory belonged not to the brave, but to the tactically superior. Europe would never again underestimate the steppes, and the Mongol Empire had proven once more that adaptation conquers tradition. Mobility defeats armor, and intelligence triumphs over courage alone.